All right, let's look at some of the numbers behind how the U.S. can pay off its debt. This is part two, and I want to specifically look at the consumption number. There are several numbers to look at. Currently, the economic perspective of growth is GDP equals consumption plus investment plus government expenditures plus net exports, which, by the way, our net exports is the negative number there. However, one of the things to consider about that equation is there's a lot of different, I shouldn't say a lot, but there's several different opportunities for whether it's taxes or to pay off the debt. But I'm going to highlight private consumption. So this right here, the I is the private consumption. This is government consumption, the G. But private consumption in 2013 was $11.4 trillion. Okay. Right off the bat, if we did a 10% value-added tax on private consumption, that would be $1.14 trillion. If we wanted to pay off our debt in 10 years, you basically are going to be, we would need to pay $1.7 trillion a year plus interest. So whatever the interest is on that, okay? So this 10% value-added tax just on this, I'm sorry, not the I, so the I is the G. It's the consumption, private consumption is the C. Just on this private consumption, the 10% value-added tax would be 1.14 trillion. Okay. Now, it is true that consumers might cut back, and so that figure would be lower. That could always happen. That's totally true. However, if goods are becoming cheaper, like in deflation, right? If computers are going from $2,000 to $300 as a case in point, putting a value-added tax on those goods, for instance, is not going to be something that consumers are going to feel like they're getting poor. In fact, that was, in my opinion, that's one of the mistakes, one of the typical mistakes of the federal government is there have been all kinds of opportunities where goods have fallen in price by 70 to 80%. They could easily have tacked on a 20% value-added tax, for instance, on, let's say, a laptop that goes from $3,000 to $300. That's a 90% collapse in price, right? Well, if somebody paid a 20% value-added tax on that $300 laptop, right? I mean, it would still be $360. The consumer still feels like he or she is saving money, right? So some of this is taking advantage of when the price of goods plummets like that. Like I mentioned with Theranos and blood test, go ahead and take advantage of that. It's still going to be cheaper for consumers overall, and they're not going to feel like they're paying a lot of money in taxes. They're not. It's just kind of using the brain to figure this out. It's like LEO Motors. It comes out, let's say it's a successful car, then go ahead and tax the purchase of the car a little bit. It's still $6,800. I mean, that is cheaper than some used cars. Cheaper than a significant number, I should say, of used cars, right? So it's just being smart and understanding when you can go ahead and tack on maybe even a 20% value-added tax, right? When consumers when they feel like they're getting more for their money, they're not going to mind paying value-added taxes. And that's just understanding the nature of price deflation can do that, right? I mean, when people feel like they can get more for their money, you can tack on a little bit of extra taxes. It's not a bad thing. But anyway, paying off the debt in 10 years is very aggressive, 1.7 trillion a year plus interest. Paying off the debt 20 years means 850 billion a year plus interest. You see that the 10% value-added tax exceeds the 850 billion. So just on the consumption part of this, right, you have a 10% value-added tax would contribute to that 20 years. And that frees up not quite 300, but 200-ish, 200 plus billion of dollars for paying interest. Okay. Another thing to note too as well, I just want to point this out. Americans talk a lot about the price of education going up. One of the things that's not mentioned is the price of education is rising because of the number of foreign students attending U.S. colleges. In the 2012-2013, there was 816,644 foreign students attending U.S. colleges. This does create inflationary pressure on U.S. students, right? If they weren't attending U.S. colleges, college would be cheaper, right? But this is creating demand. I have nothing wrong with that, right? If I went to China and I wanted to be educated in China, I would expect as a U.S. student or as a U.S. citizen, I would be paying some extra money. I would be creating inflationary pressure on their citizens. The key here, though, is this is a form of an export in the sense that people are coming to our country and are using their dollars to buy our goods, which is education. Okay, and there's nothing wrong with that, but the point is that this is something that we could look at, since this does affect U.S. students. It's not a free cost for us locally. Okay, looking at what we could do to tax that if people are going to continue coming to U.S. colleges. There's nothing against people coming to U.S. colleges, but there are some things we could look at as far as taxes, not only to alleviate maybe even U.S. students, but also as well to limit the number of foreign students just creating a huge amount of demand. I actually, again, if these foreign students stay here in the U.S., you could easily reimburse all of that in the long run, right? If they do stay here permanently. But if they go back, that's especially a thing to consider. So these are just some other things to consider. There will be other numbers as well that I'll look at later on. But if you look at it from a consumption perspective or private consumption, there's some opportunities in private consumption to do value-added taxes and to start making the national debt very manageable as far as paying it back without consumers feeling like they're getting slammed. A 10% value-added tax would decrease consumption, I have no doubt, but it's not going to decrease it to all of a sudden $2 trillion. That's absurd. It's just not. And so there are things that we could do. A good one, by the way, right now, right off the bat, is when oil prices collapse like they do, below $2 a gallon, I don't know why the U.S. government doesn't just go ahead and say, okay, well, we're going to go ahead and just tack it to $2.25 a gallon, period. And then when it goes over that, then we're going to remove whatever that tax is. But to set basically a flat tax point that if it goes below that, whatever is going below at the gas station, it's mandatory $2.25. Take that money and invest in alternative energy, because again, energy is something that we're exporting a lot of dollars for. These are things they could do, and they're very sensible, and it wouldn't hurt people that much. And in the long run, it would really help. They're choosing not to do it, though.